All right, this evening we have a truly intriguing lineup for you. Tonight's program is called Artificial Intelligence, Our Brains and Our Bodies. We're going to be exploring brain-computer interfaces and how those neurotechnologies present a variety of opportunities, challenges, and risks. We have two speakers, De-Shaine Murray and Matthew Liao, who will each give a presentation. Then we'll have those two in conversation with each other here on stage. And following that, we will take questions from you, our wonderful audience. Now, first up, we are very excited to welcome De-Shaine Murray. He is a neuroscientist and bioengineer at Yale's Tsai Institute and the Yale Neuroscience Analytics Group. There, he works on the development of multimodal monitoring tools for the brain, and he's also the co-founder of Black in Neuro, a nonprofit organization that celebrates and empowers Black scholars in neuroscience-related fields. Dr. Murray and his work have been featured in the Journal of Neuroscience, Stat News, and on NPR. Please welcome De-Shaine Murray.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Great. So the reason for our late starting is actually me, so I apologize. I had my first interaction with New York traffic. And yeah, let's just say nearly 2 hours in an Uber, that took a lot out of me. But hopefully, we can have a really good discussion today. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you also to the Dana Foundation and Secret Science Club. Really happy and excited to be here and really get the conversation going. So essentially, we're going to talk a bit about brain-computer interfaces, and really the challenges, the risks, everything in between. But the title of my talk today is How Far is Too Far? And the reason for that is because I believe that in a push for pursuing equity, which is where a lot of brain-computer interfaces may lie, we may actually facilitate inequality. So we're going to have that discussion today, kind of bring you through a few things. I'll explain my position. We'll probably have a back and forth with Matthew, the other speaker. But yeah, really looking forward to just getting down to the nitty-gritty of brain-computer interfaces. So essentially at this time, we're in a very exciting time in terms of innovation. There's a lot of funding, and there's essentially a lot of interfaces that are coming out that have the potential to augment our lives, treat neurological conditions, and essentially do things in ways that we haven't been able to do previously. I would just like to state with a stance, I'm all for novel brain-computer interfaces, but I already don't like the prospect of enhancing human function beyond our current capabilities, and I will explain why. So, if you get nothing else from this talk, I would like you to at least focus on know about the global neurological burden. So, with regards to brain-computer interface, I think there's a real opportunity, and I will define a brain-computer interface in a second, to address neurological disorders that we have. So often when we think about disease, we think about disease in the case of somebody dies, somebody survives. And with regards to neurological disorders, there is a massive burden with regards to death. So in 2016, there were approximately 9 million deaths as a result of neurological disorders. This ranges from stroke to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's, etc. But we often negate or ignore this, which is the disability as a result of neurological disorders. So this group of diseases, disorders, and injuries is the leading cause of disability-adjusted life years lost. Essentially, this is a metric that quantifies disability, but really speaks to those people who will survive an injury, but will struggle to go or will not be able to work or go and fend for themselves, will have to have private care, or will be in a position where they can no longer talk, or may even be in a position where they can no longer walk. So if I can draw your attention quickly, if you can see here, I actually work in this field around stroke. There's also traumatic brain injury, so I work with patients who have been severely injured after a brain injury or a stroke. But as you can see even from there, there's a massive burden in terms of disability, but also in terms of death. This is where I believe brain-computer interfaces are actually well-positioned to address this problem. So going a step further, and we're now 4 years into a pandemic, and this pandemic is now endemic. But a study that essentially came out in Denmark was a profile of around 920,000 patients. They were tested for COVID-19, and 43,000 or so tested positive. But within that, we saw that there was a 3.5 times increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, a 2.6 times increased risk of Parkinson's disease, a 2.7 times increased risk of stroke, and a 4.8 times increased risk of bleeding on the brain. So this is something that we're going to have to deal with for the long term. COVID is now endemic, so it will be with us consistently, but we need to look at the issues with regards to long COVID and potentially circumventing the major disability that can affect our societies currently. So if the audio will permit me, I have a video essentially to look at where we are right now. And since we're in Brooklyn, I think it's only fair that we look at a Brooklyn-based brain-computer interface startup company in Synchron.
Rodney Gorham, an ALS patient who's mostly immobile, sent us an iMessage.
Yes.
Directly from his brain.
Oh, feels good.
Gorham has a brain implant called a stentrode, which translates his thoughts into digital commands.
This is the first time the FDA has approved any commercial device to be permanently implanted.
It's a big step toward the melding of mind and machine. But what are brain implants?
Brain-computer interfaces is a technology that harnesses brain signal from the user, interprets that brain signal, decodes it, and then uses the decoded brain signal to control an external device. Now, that external device could be something as simple as a mouse pointer, or it can be something as complex as a high-dimensional robotic arm.
So you heard it there. Essentially, a BCI is a computer-based system that will acquire your signals, analyze them, translate them into commands, and then there's some form of output. In the video there, that was the ability to send an iMessage for an ALS patient. But it could be a range of things. It could be neuroprosthesis, so the ability to move a robotic arm. It could be to move a cursor on a screen, etc. And so the neural implant in that case was the stentrode, which is placed directly in the vasculature of the brain. So this is the field that I am also in. So I make neural implants, and we place them inside the body, and essentially they're there to interact with the neurons. And this is all part of a wider field of bioelectronics, which is a multidisciplinary field which integrates biology and electronics for diagnostic and therapeutic healthcare treatments. So those are a few definitions just to kind of orient everyone in the room. But essentially, what or where do we measure? So as a result of us trying to pass out more complex information, BCIs and brain-computer interface, and specifically the neural implants, have to be a lot more invasive than previously. And it's actually 100 years now since Hans Berger essentially recorded the first electroencephalogram in 1924, and he saw brain signals from the scalp of the brain. And we can do that regularly. That's essentially a staple of current neuroscience. However, in terms of decoding that information and getting out something on a spatial level where you can say, okay, this neuron did this neuron did this, we have to get much further and deeper into the brain. So the different BCI companies at the moment are going through various different approaches, essentially to acquire these signals. So in the case of Synchron, they have an intravascular interface, as you can see here. So this actually goes directly through, say, a vein or an artery, and is able to then listen in to brain signals that are acquired there. You most certainly probably heard of Neuralink, for better or worse. But they have the approach of an intercavarial interface, which essentially sits within the skull. A disc is kind of cut out, and then they have these threads or fibers that extrude down and actually go directly into the brain tissue. There's also other ways of doing this with increasing levels of invasiveness. There can be an ECOG interface, so electrocorticography, where an implant can sit directly on the surface of the cortex, can be quite flexible to mold to the surface of the brain. And another New York-based startup known as Precision Neuroscience has this sort of approach. And last but not least, there'll be something an interface that can essentially go directly into the tissue. And this would be like an LFP interface or a depth electrode interface where you are right next to the neurons and can potentially pick up single unit activity. So what one neuron is doing or a collection of neurons. And essentially, this is to get a better spatial resolution. We want to know exactly what's happening at specific areas, so then you can potentially decode behavior, movements, vision, etc. So what do I measure? So full disclosure, I am not in the BCI space, so I actually work on neural implants. I'm currently working on a new device to monitor brain injury, where we're combining a few different measures. So we're combining pressure, oxygen, temperature, and electrical activity via EEG. So taking you through very quickly. So the pressure sensor will be there, the oxygen sensor there. EEG contacts, so 4 of them, essentially as a depth electrode. And then there's also a temperature sensor that's implanted as well. So this is mainly for those who have brain injuries, who end up in neurointensive care after a very serious car accident, or maybe a cerebrovascular incident. So as a result, they end up comatose. Often you have to stem the bleeds, and these are very serious injuries. But at the moment, we have a neural implant for each one of these different parameters. So you'll have a pressure sensor, an oxygen sensor, a temperature sensor, and an EEG sensor. So essentially, we're bringing these all together into one probe, essentially to help clinicians and provide all of that information in one place, so we can potentially lead to better outcomes for patients. And just in a bit more detail, so this is the neuroprobe within the bolt, as you can see here. And this is classic neurosurgery, where you actually have a hand drill, not like the sophisticated things that many of the startups that I'm going to explain currently use. But essentially, you will go in, a neurosurgeon will have the hand drill, twist around, and essentially attach a bolt that's fixed to the skull. And the neuroprobe in our case, or any other sort of catheter-based device, can then be threaded through, and it will actually protrude into the brain tissue, and then be able to record the signals. So we're currently testing on the bench, but we'll soon be having a preclinical trial about this, and we're looking at measuring pressure, temperature, oxygen, and EEG in real time. So very quickly, on my research specifically, we're looking at creating a fully integrated multimodal monitoring system, and there'll be acquisition, display, and also analysis. But just as a distinction from what we're talking about today, this is not a brain-computer interface, because we're not then adding a specific output that can be user-controlled. Essentially, here we're looking at combining more modalities into one device, and this is because, if you can see in the picture, it can be a very crowded environment with lots of wires, lots of different acquisition equipment from various different companies. It can be quite an expense to a hospital as well. So we're really looking at condensing that down and streamlining these things. Also looking at developing a closed loop system. So this will actually take the sort of devices that I make more towards a brain-computer interface, where essentially you have a smart implant that can react to the signals that it has. And really, I would like to push forward the use of chronic implants. But what about the leaders in this space? So this is probably what everyone came here to talk about today, which is various brain-computer interfaces, which are reaching a stage where we're actually at a clinical trial stage. So many of these devices have actually already been implanted in patients. And we're really at a critical point where we can decide, okay, how can we address certain neurological disorders, and then be in a position to see where we go from there. So the first one I'm going to take you through is Synchron, as I said before. So this is an intravascular implant, which I explained a bit of, and they have this stentrode, which is inserted via an endovascular procedure. So this is currently in 6 US patients, so there's a clinical trial going on as we speak. I know that they're not too far from here, probably about 10 or 15 minutes from here. But there's also more going on in Australia, and that's where the original video was from. So this is targeted at helping those who have limited hand mobility. So we'll be allowing them to control this touchscreen, allowing them to send a message, and really kind of allowing people to interact with the world where they may have lost that ability. Next is BlackRock Neurotech. So many people don't actually know, with regards to brain-computer interfaces, there is a long history. It does stem back right the way to the first electroencephalogram in 1924. But in terms of brain-computer interfaces that were implanted, BlackRock Neurotech actually takes the cake in terms of being one of the first to do so. So this is one of the oldest and most validated implants, which is known as the Utah array. As it was first implanted in a patient in 2004. So there are these intracortical electrodes that can be between 96 to 128 electrodes in one array, and then these can be stacked together for essentially monitoring more complex behavior. So this device has been used for controlling prostheses, so for robotic arms, etc., for speech assistance, most recently actually decoding words with thought, and potentially restoring vision in some capacity through stimulation. So this is really a company to keep an eye out for, essentially because they've been in this space for a while. They may not necessarily get all the media plaudits as others may, but they are really doing some cool work and are collaborating with many within the research space, such as the consortium of BrainGate, to really push forward what BCIs can do for neurological disorders. Next is Precision Neuroscience. So they have electrocorticography interface. They call it the layer 7 cortical interface, which has 1,024 electrodes varying from 50 microns in size to 380 micrometers in size. So this is 10 to the minus 9 nanometers. So very small. Essentially, they can insert their devices via a microslit, which they claim to be reversible as a process. And they haven't directly targeted applications as of yet. They're still creating the device and building upon it. But it's a potentially useful platform technology that the research community would like, but also for the various applications I've talked about before with regards to restoring potential mobility or the ability to communicate. This is a really potentially useful platform. And last but not least is Neuralink. So this sits in a cavity around the skull. So they also have, or are developing, what we know as an R1 surgical robot, which they can essentially cut out a circle, like a disc also in the skull, place the neural implant, and this has about 1,024 recording sites in 64 small fibers that can be implanted exactly where they would like them to be. So very, I guess, hot off the press news for them is that they have recently entered human clinical trials for those with quadriplegia, so those who've lost the ability to move their arms and legs. So it's a very interesting time within this space, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops in terms of the success of their device, but also the efficacy. Because there are many key uses, and you can pass out the fact that we're talking about allowing communication to those who are impaired, or restoring mobility after injury, potentially controlling prosthesis. But we also need to look at where we're going with this and what is the next step and next stage. And that's where I kind of urge caution. So we have another small video, but this is more so from the research community. This was a study, I think, that came out last year, which essentially used a brain-computer interface to restore the ability for someone to move their legs after paralysis. So I will let the patient explain a little bit further.
I'm Gertjan. 12 years ago I got an accident and had a spinal cord injury, so I'm not able to move my legs anymore. Within 5 to 10 minutes I could control my hips, like they were like the brain implant picked up what I was doing with my hips, so that was like the best outcome, I think, for everyone. I can really build functional things from it. To just an example, I'm training 10 years to stand up with a friend having a beer. And that's something I think people don't.
So as you can see, they're pretty powerful stuff. The fact that you can potentially give someone the ability to walk again purely by stimulating and then having essentially a closed loop relay system that allows for the legs to move. But where to? And I think this is an important juncture that we're at. I think this is also where we should stay and should build on. But there are a variety of considerations. So the first thing I want to say, and this is, I guess, more so to the general public, is the fact that these brain-computer interfaces, although very swanky, very cool, there's essentially something of science fiction, it is surgery. And until we get to a stage where we can implant these things without major concerns, there are huge risks attached at the moment. You're also implanting a foreign body into the brain, and there is the possibility of introducing infection, and there is also the possibility of damaging the brain itself. There is also the fact that the device can fail, so what do we do in those cases? So there are generally a few considerations that we need to have. I would also like to state at the same time that I have little issue with non-invasive BCIs. Essentially, these are removable. They provide little health risk. But essentially for the reasons described earlier about spatial resolution, the functionality can be quite limited in terms of what we can do, and definitely can't currently do what you saw in the last video. So I have no issue with the non-invasive BCIs because we can remove them. There's less of a risk because we're not going directly into brain tissue. But where I find and take fault and where I see dangers is potentially with the next step, where we're looking at potentially enhancing humans. Who stands to benefit from this? And I think we've seen various discussions even about artificial intelligence and its uses, the biases that can be reproduced with regards to bad data in, essentially leading to bad data out. When historical information is put into AI, it essentially reproduces those biases again, and this has been seen in policing, it's been seen in healthcare, etc. But what happens with brain-computer interfaces where essentially connecting a computer directly to our brains? So there's the issue of societal inequality. Can everybody be able to afford such BCIs? We're currently doing this for neurological disorders, but what happens if someone says, okay, I would like that implanted into me so I can improve my cognitive ability? Should we say yes? Should we say no? And I think those are the types of discussions that we should be having now rather than 5 to 10 years in the future when it's potentially too late. There's also the issue of weaponization and an altered perception. And so one of my favorite Black Mirror episodes is actually Men Against Fire. If you haven't watched it, it would be good to watch, just because it actually takes you through kind of the ideas behind a brain implant that's essentially mass-produced and used essentially to justify a genocide. And I think so it passes out some really interesting discussions and essentially is where we may be going. So I feel that at the moment we're in science fiction, but in a few years we could be in science fact. And I think it's time that we actually look at the consequences of the potential decisions that we could take. So in short, and this is a summary because I would like to get into discussing and also to hear Dr. Liao's presentation, but BCIs provide an opportunity to address the disability that results from neurological diseases, injuries, and disorders. Commercial translation is at the cusp. We're getting close. Clinically, there are a few things to be done in terms of safety and efficacy. We could get there, but it's also potentially a double-edged sword because it's a new platform that can be used correctly, and there's a new platform that can also be abused and used incorrectly. So my belief currently is that we should regulate our efforts, essentially to restoring human function, rather than pushing to enhance our abilities. And I also believe that failing to do so can have very grave consequences. So I'll stop there for now, and I know we'll come to questions later, but thank you for listening.
So I'll get started. So we're on the cusp. That's okay. It's meant to be blank. So we're on the cusp of developing a certain kind of technology, neurotechnology, that can give us an unprecedented ability to peer into our mind and to influence specific neural processes. So neurotechnologies such as brain-computer interface, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and psychopharmaceuticals have the potential to alter what we remember and forget, what we think and what we believe, and what we feel and what we perceive. So they can thus radically change our sense of where we come from, what we do, and importantly, who we are. And these neurotechnologies, as Dr. Murray has already mentioned, raise a number of ethical issues, sometimes quite controversial issues. And in my role as an ethicist, I study and investigate these issues. And sometimes I even make recommendations of right or wrong conduct. And so what I want to do today is to look at some of these technologies through a couple scenarios. So a 10-year-old girl whose rapist was sentenced to 15 to 18 years in jail in Florida told the court, "I wish I could forget and have a new brain so that I don't have to remember. I wish I could forget." It's a haunting phrase that comes up again and again in the testimony of those who have suffered or witnessed terrible crimes. But increasingly, scientists are uncovering new ways of manipulating memories. So for instance, there's a research team at SUNY Downstate and also at NYU that have found that there's this molecule, it's called PKM-zeta. It's a molecule thought to be needed for strengthening the connections between brain cells. And they found that when you raise the enzyme level of PKM-zeta, you can actually enhance a rodent's ability to remember. And when you block that enzyme, it results in selective erasure of certain memories, which is pretty striking. Another example is optogenetics. So this is something where it's a technique where you use light to manipulate and study nerve cells that have been sensitized to light. So using optogenetics, a team at MIT found that unpleasant memories in rodents can be neutralized or even reassociated with more positive emotions. And in another study, they found that they can even insert false memories, kind of like the movie Inception. So such research raises hope for treating very severe traumatic memories. And it's possible that within the next decade, we'll be able to develop what I call memory modification technologies, so MMTs. So what are some of the ethical issues surrounding the use of MMTs? Well, most obviously, people will be concerned that these technologies may be used to harm other people. You can just imagine someone commits a crime and then makes the victim forget. But we should also be aware that these technologies can result in harm to ourselves in subtle ways, and that's what I want to explore a bit. So for instance, memories are evidence of events that have taken place. So modifying our memories could therefore alter what we believe to be true about these events and cause us to live in falsehood. Imagine a soldier who uses MMTs, and as a result, he can't remember what he did during a war. How would he react if he were presented with evidence of his behavior in the war, especially if the evidence conflicted with the identity that he has now fashioned for himself? The use of MMTs can also affect our ability to respond as moral agents. So say you're hit by a drunk driver, and then you're given a treatment at the hospital to soften the emotional memory, to forget that it happened, right? Later, you run into the driver again, not literally this time, but looking back at the event, you might feel, wow, it was not that great, but you don't really feel the anguish that you would have otherwise felt. And when the driver asks for forgiveness, isn't there a risk that you would just not even bother or forgive him too easily? Forgiveness is an important moral reaction that requires us to overcome our moral indignation for the sake of our moral values. A failure to feel such emotions may preclude genuine forgiveness. We may also have moral and legal duties to remember certain events. So, for example, Neil Armstrong's memory of landing on the moon may not just be evidence for him, but also for the rest of the world. Would using MMTs to remove certain memories prevent us from meeting our obligations to ourselves and to others? Now, I do want to say that for most of us, the point of MMTs will be to enhance our personal well-being. And I think people should be at liberty to decide whether to use these kind of technologies unless they are going to use it to harm other people. But given that inappropriate use of MMTs can cause a bunch of self-harms, cause us to live in falsehood, affect our ability to respond as moral agents, and prevent us from meeting our obligations, I think we need to be careful. And the correct use of applications of MMTs are going to require us to understand what the use of that means for our lives and the role of certain memories in our lives. Here's another scenario. War veterans are returning from combat with post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD. Many can't live normal lives. So at least 22 veterans commit suicide every single day. 22 veterans commit suicide every single day. That's a huge number. In the US, DARPA, so the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, is spending millions of dollars to develop novel devices that would address neurological disorders such as PTSD. Now, DARPA is particularly interested in something called deep brain stimulation, so DBS. And DBS involves inserting a thin electrode through a small opening in your skull to a specific area in the brain. The electrode is then connected by an insulated wire to a battery pack underneath the skin, and the battery pack then sends electrical signals via the wire to the brain. And about 100,000 people around the world today have DBS, a DBS implant for things like Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, and major depression. And there's some evidence that DBS can also be helpful for PTSD. So brain imaging shows that amygdala hyperactivity is responsible for the symptoms of PTSD, and that DBS can functionally reduce the activity of the amygdala. And so what DARPA wants to do, though, is to come up with the next generation of DBS, call them DBS Plus, that do not require user input, and that can read and monitor the brain's activities in real time using neural recording and AI, and intervene in these activities in an automatic way through electrical simulation. So DARPA's goal is, of course, they want to treat the soldiers. But the issue here is that once you create DBS Plus, it could be used also to enhance soldiers, something that Dr. Murray had already mentioned. DBS Plus could, for example, be used to preempt PTSD. Say a soldier just experienced some very traumatic, potentially traumatic event. Well, the DBS could be used to detect and categorize the emotional reaction in the amygdala. So like, hurricane warnings, right? You can sort of have different categories. So category 4, it would sort of automatically reduce the activity of the amygdala by a certain degree. If it's a category 5, then it's going to slow it down to a halt. DBS Plus, though, could also be used to remove fear by increasing adrenaline in soldiers, and that's just pure enhancement. So how should we think about the ethics of using something like DBS Plus? Well, one issue is, will soldiers be coerced using such devices? The military command structure is hierarchical. What about peer pressure? Would one get a DBS Plus because other soldiers are getting it? Or maybe the pressure to succeed is overwhelming. After all, soldiers with such implants may be more reliable soldiers. Can we ban DBS Plus like the way we ban doping? It's not clear that we can. I mean, the point of banning doping is in sports, is to ensure fairness. But do soldiers really care about fairness? Would soldiers voluntarily give up their Apache helicopters and night vision goggles just to level the playing field? And these soldiers may actually want to have DBS Plus precisely because they can confer combat advantage. Would the use of DBS Plus lead to soldiers without conscience? I think this is a serious concern. But interestingly, this may be a technical problem. implants that remove our ability, our morality, to our ability to think morally are not really enhancements per se, and therefore are not really desirable. We don't really want psychopaths to be running around battlefields. So the interesting issue is actually this. What if we have implants that enable a soldier to kill appropriately at the right time, for the right reasons, and in a proportionate manner? Will we still have an ethical problem with soldiers using such technology? Here's a third scenario, and this is getting into more of the realm of science fiction, but I thought it was interesting, so we can kind of talk about it. So I'm going to begin with 3 assumptions, which I think there are reasons to accept them, but accepting them leads to some sort of interesting puzzle. So the first assumption is something called the work-product doctrine. And so currently, governments and corporations own the work that you do for them and the tools and, for example, the laptops and the phones that you use to produce the work. So if you leave your job, you can be required to hand over your laptops and phones and sign a document of non-disclosure. The grounds for work-product doctrine are trade secrets, fiduciary duty, confidentiality, and contractual relationships. Here's a second assumption, and it's something called the extended mind hypothesis. This is a philosopher's invention. It's actually by my colleague Dave Chalmers at NYU. So this hypothesis says that the mind is not contained only within the boundaries of the skull. And specifically, and this bit is kind of technical, if objects in the world that function as processes, which were they to take place inside your head, we would say that they're part of the cognitive processes, then those objects are part of the cognitive processes. So let me give you an example. So on the extended mind hypothesis, your iPhone could be your extended mind, right? I mean, just think of, losing your phone may be akin to getting a lobotomy, right? Think of all the phone numbers in there, right? Okay, here's the third assumption. Memory modification technologies. We already talked about this. So let's assume that it's possible to erase memory selectively. Now, suppose we accept these 3 assumptions. Now consider the following scenario. You work for the government and you're about to leave the job. The government can take away the computer and the phone that you've been using to do your work. Suppose that selective erasure memory is possible. Is the government permitted to selectively erase the information in your head? Is the government permitted to do this when you leave work every single day? So you might think, well, there's something special about your brain. This is brain exceptionalism, right? But if the extended mind hypothesis is true, there should be no difference between information that's on your computer and on your phone and the information in your head. And DARPA, by the way, is interested also in creating prosthetic memories. And so suppose we receive brain implants to store these memories. So if government is permitted to take your computer and phone, is the government permitted to take your brain implant? Would a right to privacy protect us in such a case? Well, in the US, the 4th Amendment protects us against illegal searches, and the 5th Amendment protects us against self-incrimination. But these amendments are intended to protect us against the government. Are they actually that helpful in the workplace? And it's not clear that they are. Employers have such broad powers to engage in surveillance activities in the workplace. They can monitor pretty much everything, your emails, your online activities, every keystroke you type, and so on, with the possible exception of when you go to the toilet. If the right to privacy doesn't seem helpful, what then? So I'm going to wrap up. Now I've sketched some dystopia. I realized that I've just sketched some dystopian scenarios, but I think it's important to step back and recognize that, at least right now, a number of the neurotechnologies that are being developed are being used to treat conditions such as PTSD, where the pain can be quite unbearable. In those cases especially, it doesn't have to be morally problematic to use neurotechnologies to help us craft and shape our identities. So while we should be cautious when developing these technologies Dr. Murray is entirely right. We need to make sure that they're all safe, for example. We should also embrace the potential that using these technologies can enhance and transform our lives. Thank you very much.
We're going to have Matthew Liao and De-Shaine Murray in conversation now, and I can take your lap back if you like.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. All right. Great. Okay, so I guess we can get started.
Sure.
So I really enjoy your presentation. I had a question for you, especially at the end about sort of racism and AI. It's so pervasive. It's really, really bad. And it's the garbage in, garbage out problem, and they're trying to fix that problem. But there's one thing that I was thinking that as you were talking, where like at least in the brain space, the problem might not come up as much. And here's what I'm thinking. So actually, let me start by saying that there are scientists who think that they're political brains, so they're Republican brains and they're Democrat brains. Like apparently they're sort of neurosignatures, you can find them. In ethics, I edited this volume, it's called The Moral Brains, and apparently some people claim that they're Kantian brains versus utilitarian brains, right? So the utilitarians, according to Josh Green, he's a professor at Harvard, he thinks that they tend to use the prefrontal cortex more, whereas the Kantians, they tend to react more emotionally, so they use the amygdala, right? Okay, but setting that aside, I take it like, you can't really see race in brains, can you? Like, I mean, there's sort of there are socioeconomic stuff that you can see in the brain, but can you see race in the brain itself? Like, sort of just looking at the brain signatures.
Oh, that's that's not directly my field, but I would say tentative answer would be no. As many will know, that race is actually a social construct rather than biological fact. So with that in mind, it's essentially what we've been socialized into. I think a better barometer is, especially if you're looking at determinants of health, can be in terms of ancestry, and that can vary via the regions of where you are in terms of geographical location rather than race itself. So I would say no in terms of there being a racial brain, but just based on even the conversation around AI, not just conversation, but also the implementation, even within the UK, well, I know it's been used in the US, so the UK where I'm from, but policing, for example, as an example that I gave, and also computer vision and just facial recognition, and how bad that has been in terms of misrepresenting or essentially trying to recognize a person and getting that wrong, leading to people being stopped and searched, etc. That's just one example where AI is taken, and the AI itself is not racist, but it's taken the historical data, it's taken data from there and reproduced it in the wrong way. So I have those same concerns with regards to BCIs. With regards to where we're going, I don't think we're there yet in understanding the full concerns, but I feel that we need to essentially innovate with people in the room who understand and essentially can then be instead of being at the receiving end of it, we're actually there and being part of the solution. That's essentially having diverse teams and people who are like, okay, that doesn't look wrong or that doesn't work, and kind of go from that.
Great, okay. And in your talk, you were quite worried about enhancements, right? Can you just say a bit more about your concerns,
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess it's more so the case of where I see BCIs, it's about restoring function, or giving a function where, someone may have lost function or someone may have never had that function, but allowing people to exist in the world equally, as best to our ability. I think there's no question that we have many societal inequalities, but I do think if you're then giving a person a BCI, and we just know from history just how innovation is often unequal, and it will go to the person who can afford it, as opposed to everybody. I think that personally is going to be a problem, and something that we should begin to address from now, because, I guess for me, I'm from the UK, private healthcare has been a struggle to me in terms of just the concept of it. I won't go too, but as an example. So what happens if a BCI is tied to your insurance? And say you have a neurological disorder, you're only able to pay for it based on your employment. And then for whatever reason, you can no longer work in that place. And then does the BCI get removed or anything like that? And I think those are the types of questions we need to pass out a bit more and get to the bottom of before we then move forward and innovate in a way that essentially leads to this huge barrier.
Yeah, so I work in bioethics, and similar issues come up with non-BCI related stuff. So one thing is with the sort of like pacemakers, right? So if your insurance stops covering, can they just come and take your pacemakers away, or and things like that? The answer is no, by the way. But yes, so. I think they're definitely, you're absolutely right. We need regulations in this space. There are a lot of these new technologies, and we haven't really been thinking about them. We don't really have legal regulations there. But the other argument you make, so I take it a lot of it is about socioeconomic, inequalities, the fact that the haves will get access to the new technologies earlier, usually. And so, and so on and so forth. But some people might make the argument, and they tend to make this argument, take iPhones, right? It's true that in the beginning, only the really wealthy, they got, like now Apple Vision Pro. How many people have Apple Vision Pro here? So yeah, it's my colleague Dave Chalmers has one. So it's $3,500. Only some people can have it. But eventually, the cost is going to go down, economies of scale, right? And so now everybody has an iPhone, right? So when it first came out, it was really expensive. And now, even think of all the innovation also in other parts of the world, right? They're now saying that it's a right. You have a right to be online and so on and so forth. Yep. So why couldn't technologies be like that where, also with BCIs, it's true that the first iteration, it's only going to go to someone who can really afford it because it's going to cost millions of dollars. But later on, look at all these people. I mentioned 22 million soldiers commit suicide every single day. Shouldn't we be helping them?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I agree that we should be.
Well, when it's cheaper,
So I guess the example I'll give you is a completely non-BCI example, but it's in the news even today, which would be Boeing. So I don't want to go too deeply into that, but I guess the idea of when you then scale up and when you put such, I guess in the case of BCIs, you put such devices in the hands of, say, a private company or the hands of a person that his main goal is profit, it's then what, I guess, the corners or what shortcuts are essentially made. And I think we've seen that with regards to even just the recent viral videos of essentially wheels falling off and doors opening, etc. That's something that's been done at scale. So I then worry then when we look to put BCIs from just being neurological or to helping us with neurological disorders, that we go to something that's then mass produced, there may be an issue with regards to the quality and also the effect that it has.
Yeah. But you did fly from England to here, right? Right? So you trust the technology enough to take it, even though sometimes that does happen. And aviation, it turns out, Boeing is in trouble, but so don't buy their stocks. In general, aviation is pretty safe. And why is it safe? It's safe not because they don't make money, they do make money. It's safe because we have very robust regulations. Sure. Actually in the 60s, airplanes used to fall out of the sky every other day. And so the government, they just came together and they said, we need to fix this problem. And it became one of the safest industries because of regulation. Another example is pharmaceuticals, right? Drug discoveries. It's not perfect. There are a lot of, I'm a bioethicist, I can tell you all the problems with, drug, innovation, and also how much it costs and things like that. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of innovation, and it's not a perfect system, but we incentivize companies to produce these things. So, and it's kind of like a win-win situation, right? And as a result, people's life expectancies have generally gone up, except during the COVID, years. But so like, why not think that we can expect something like a similar trajectory with respect to BCIs? Like, because we're just looking at the beginning. If you look at the beginning, it looks really bad. But if you look at if you take a more long view, it doesn't look as bad. What do you think?
Okay. So it's an interesting question you posit. I think, well, with regards to, we'll stay in aviation for a little bit. With regards to, I wasn't around in the 60s, so I don't know how
I wasn't either. So
planes were falling out of the sky. But in terms of the regulation, it was reactionary rather than proactive. And I think that's a stage that we're at now, where we can actually be proactive about the regulation so that we don't end up in a position where BCIs are, well, the equivalent of a person or falling out of the sky. So I think that's the difference. An example I would give is, again, not in the BCI space, but in technology and innovation. I still, I'll probably, after this, but probably a bit nervous, I'll go to the bathroom or the restroom and I will use the soap dispenser. And just from the way that has been designed, it doesn't actually work as well for my hands compared to someone with a lighter hue or certain different skin. There's certain technologies that have been made and they haven't been made with everybody in mind. And I think that we're now in this, again, another frontier, which is brain-computer interfaces, and we need to make that correction from the beginning. And that's where I stand.
Yeah. Totally agree. I mean, just to support your point, just to show that even current regulation may not be that good with respect to pharmaceutical, drug discovery, et cetera, et cetera. It's the case of Neuralink, right? So Neuralink was able to have their first human trial. And you might think that's way too premature. I mean, they tested on 100 monkeys or something like that, and so many of them died, right? and now, like, without even further testing, they're already engaging in human, sort of subject trials. So you might think that's something went wrong there, but they got approved, and so maybe that process could be improved as well. So yeah. Did you have questions for me?
I guess, as a bioethicist, and then looking at the work that, I guess, neuroscientists, bioengineers are doing, I guess, how would I phrase this? It would be a case of, do you have genuine fears around our current trajectory as to where we're going with regards to the innovation? Because it's all well and good us talking about it now, but I guess in 5-10 years or so, these are things that are going to be out there. So do you have any fears, I guess? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I'm currently writing a book on this topic, sort of for the wider audience. And one of the things I mention in the book is that there are some people, I call them techno-optimists. So they think, these technologies are going to save the world. They're going to just, make us live 150 years and everything, and then there are people who I call techno-pessimists. And so they think they're going to kill us all. It's going to, we're dooming ourselves by engaging in all these different technologies. And so in the book, I sort of say, I'm more of a techno-realist. I think we need to really look at these issues, recognizing that they're not as rosy as we make them out to be, but they're also not as bad. Some of them could actually be good, could be helpful, and we need to look at them on a case-by-case basis. Those arguments are harder to make, but they're important to make. That's how we have reasonable, rational conversations rather than these hyperboles and exaggerated type stuff. And so one of the things I try to do in the first example about memory modification, for example, was to say, look, this technology might sound so, really great, but it does come with some costs. And so as a user, as someone, if you're going to put it in clinical trials and so on and so forth, you got to help the patient or someone who's going to, be on that trial recognize that there's going to be some cost to the self as well. There's some sort of personal harm. And so I think we don't do enough of that. We paint things at too broad a brush, and that's not always good for thinking through carefully about what we need to be doing.
like that. Also, in addition, I guess, how can we have more of these conversations? Because I would say, I'm assuming that most of the public here are a general public, not scientific audience, as in someone that's, saying doing directly research. But I know that just even you and I being in the same room or being on the same stage is actually very rare. So how do we, or are you open to having not just these conversations, but actually converting that into research so we actually make an impact?
Absolutely, yeah. I think definitely welcome this. We need to thank the Dana Foundation and the Secret Science Club again, because they have brought us together. And I think, yes, I don't know where they are, but I think this is, this type of collaboration and sort of conversations where we can kind of create, come up with creative solutions and things like that, so.
Would you mind, both of you, just thinking aloud about where the line might be when you're talking about mental disabilities and mental illnesses? It's a little less clear what where the norm is that you're trying to get to, and what happens where it becomes enhancement.
That's the question.
I think the answer to that is probably we don't know. I think so we're at a position where we can potentially set the line. I also know of, and I didn't talk about it in my talk, but Motive Neurotech is currently working on a similar sort of implant, very small, pea-sized, that could potentially shock people or give them electrical stimulation while they're dealing with bouts of depression, those sorts of things. That was kind of mentioned as well in Dr. Liao's talk with DBS. But there is that fine line as to, are we altering a person directly by giving them the shocks that they're not then experiencing life in naturally the way that they should with their brains. So I think there is no direct answer to your question at the moment, but I think that we can set the line, and with the way we set the line is from more conversations like this and actually deciding, okay, we can do something, but should we do something? And yeah, the scientific community at times is not the best at having those sorts of evaluative conversations.
And we have one right here.
Thanks for the great talk. So my question is on some of the more extreme dystopian outcomes that we're worried about, and like the material science barriers to those. So it seems like you need like a very high fidelity machine learning model that correlates brain state with outcome or action. So I guess like the question I have is, do we have sufficiently high resolution scans of different brain states? And if we do we have the technology, even like 10 years forward, where we could build a control mechanism that's sufficiently general to bring about that brain state and then that outcome? Yeah,
that's great question. So there are some technologies, but we're not allowed to use them in humans for good reasons. So I mentioned optogenetics. So optogenetics is where you sensitize certain cells to light, and then you can just switch them on and off, right? And they've been able to create these genetically modified mice that have, sort of like through, with optogenetics, modified, neurons in their brain. And so they can activate very specific neural pathways and deactivate certain very specific neural pathways. So one of the experiments that they did was the following. So this is the example that I gave about the inception, right? So they shocked a mouse, like a couple mice in the foot, right? And when they do that in a certain room, and they'll have a certain freezing behavior. Like when they go into that room later, they'll have a freezing behavior. And so through optogenetics, they were able to kind of monitor the neural network that gets activated, right? When they shock and when they're sort of freezing. Okay. So then they took a bunch of mice that have never been shocked and have never been in the room, and then they put them in the room and they activate the same neural network. And in doing that, the mice also exhibited freezing behavior as if they had been shocked. So it's as if they were given these false memories, right? It's like inception. Like literally, they had the memory of being shocked and they were, scared of that room, and then and so on and so forth. I think that Neuralink is trying to get there, right? So a lot of the sort of these deeper, more invasive technologies, they're trying to go into the brain, and they're trying to get very specific, get better neural recordings. That's exactly the challenge. And then they're trying to add that with AI. So they're trying to use artificial intelligence to decode, use through machine learning to get a bunch of the data to try to figure out patterns. And they've been pretty successful. So, Dr. Murray's examples of all these sort of the prosthetics, the walking, that's all through AI. So it's already good enough that, people can use their minds to control walking. And then, the next step would be, can we kind of figure out thoughts and things like that? And there's some research on that as well. So.
I guess I could add.
You want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think one of the main barriers, as you said, from a material science point of view, I would say that the technology has come on leaps and bounds. So I guess one thing that's definitely facilitating, this latest generation is the ability to miniaturize and put these things within a brain. But I think the difficulty we're going to have more from a neuroscience point of view is that we still don't have a full connector with the human brain, as in where we understand where everything links together. So we've done that for worms like the C. elegans, etc. We've done that for much smaller organisms, but we haven't yet done that for the human brain. And then an added issue to that is the plasticity of the brain. So the fact that you can see when parts of the human brain could be removed, but the function still exists, or the brain is essentially rewired, and that still works. So I think until we get past those two barriers, we won't then be at a stage where we can do all those crazy things, but it's possible. It's just a question of time, I would say.
Mm-hmm. We have one in the back corner.
Thank both of you so much. This is an education, and it's phenomenal. And I love the interweaving of philosophy and bioethics, as well as just the medicine and the realities of the practicality of it. There's a lot of parallels to my understanding of the discussions around lobotomies when they started. And you both referenced it obliquely, you both kind of indirectly referenced of lobotomies. And it's fascinating to see the discussion, the optimism and the caution around lobotomies when they first started. And then we hit that line. And we got to go back. We said, we don't do that anymore. And we walked back. Just kind of your thoughts on the parallel, as well as is there a line that could be hit that says we have to do something else? We saw hope, we saw question, but we're going to just shut this down and do something else. Just your thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm. You want to start? Okay, sure. It's a great question, first of all. I think the question is the answer to that is that no one has yet defined the line, because it's so new. Despite the fact that the technology's been there, we're, moving at breakneck pace to fund it. That people like you being in the room are essentially not there. So that meeting hasn't happened yet, or that collection of meetings where we then get to the point where we're like, okay, we shouldn't do that. So I guess to your point, I don't know myself where the lines. I have my general concerns about the line. And I think that's I know there will be some gray areas, but essentially where we're restoring function rather than anywhere where we go above and beyond that. But that is going to be defined at a later date, for better or worse, unfortunately.
Yeah, so for me, I think there are a couple lines, right? So one obvious one is if you're just torturing, sort of causing psychic pain, or that's a pretty bright line. You shouldn't do that, right? That's pretty easy. But there's another one, which is, I mentioned this idea of moral agency, right? Our ability to act in a moral kind of way. That means we can reason, we can kind of understand what's right and wrong. Now, just imagine that you have a neural technology, and we see that see this in science fiction as well, where that capacity gets removed or blocked, or now we don't really control our mind. We're not moral agents anymore, right? And I think that's another pretty important line. And that's something that we have to, I think that's actually a real, one of my bigger worries, right, with the BCI technology, psychopharmaceuticals is, at what point do we lose control over our actions, right? And something else takes over, right? In AI, so I've done some work on AI, and there's something called the control problem, right? And the control problem is the problem of when AIs become so smart, how do we control them, right? And one of the ideas of the control, and so, there are various solutions to control problem. Like some people say you should like put them in a box, but that's not going to work, or tripwire. Another example is tripwire, right? If they start to kind of have evil intentions towards us, then there'll be a tripwire and we'll shut everything down. But if they're super smart, they're going to get around all those different things. And the interesting thing about AI is that it sort of comes up in the brain case as well, because a lot of these systems that we're now developing are closed loop systems with AIs, right? And so it gets to a point where now you got this AI, and it's closed loop, so you have no control. And then it decides that, so you're fighting the war, and it decides that you want to stop, and it decides that you should keep fighting, right? Well, that's a problem, right? So like you can just imagine, you can multiply that scenario like in many different scenarios, to a bunch of different cases. But that's the idea. Like like the control problem becomes a problem that's inside your head because the AI is inside your head. So.
Thank you so much to both of you. You mentioned, it seems like one of the barriers is that surgery is required to get precise data from these devices. I'm interested in what you think. We see a lot of these external devices that are becoming more precise as well. If they were to one day arise to the same state as a BCI, wouldn't that immediately just break all of this? Should humans have the capacity to hack their brains, or what are the ethical considerations of that being possible?
Sure. Again, good question. I think, at least for now, or I guess where you're saying that we could go, as in with non-invasive BCIs, is the fact that we can remove something. The example I give, again, probably with the Apple Vision Pro, which was quite fun to see, the videos of people walking down the street and being kind of immersed in their own world, etc. But that's still a peripheral. It's still something that can be taken off. And I think that's my biggest fear against, the current BCIs, is that you're then implanting that indirectly. You can't take that out unless you have the capacity to do that surgery on yourself. So I guess linking in with the military case, or if you give that, someone might give consent to it, but what happens if they want to opt out afterwards and they are not in a position to do so? So I think, at least for now, those non-invasive BCIs provide that essential middle ground where, okay, I'm not liking this, I can take this off in the same way that you could take off a peripheral, or the same way you could shut off a phone. I would say it's still not perfect if we're going down the route of using BCIs for enhancing function, etc. But is much better as a scenario than something that is taken out of your control.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, basically, it'll sort of reduce the number of concerns, right? Like, with respect to safety, if you can just have that over your head rather than inside your head. But it still raises other issues, such as, the stuff that we were talking about earlier, which, if the device can control your thoughts without you knowing that it's controlling your thought, and it's getting you to do things that you wouldn't want to do otherwise, that could be problematic, right? So whether that's outside, just outside your skull, or whether it's inside your skull, like that problem would still persist. So
you'll never want to take it off.
The BCIs that you are aware of and that you mentioned, do they do the processing locally, or do they connect to a server and eventually I'll have to choose between an ad-supported version and the free premium?
From my understanding, the processing is locally. So it's usually that there'll be, the implant itself, which is directly at the interface. Then you have something, essentially a wireless transmitter or a battery pack. So everything is kind of contained within. But there is nothing to be said that we won't stay there. Again, that's another one of my fears, essentially, when you connect something like this directly up to the internet and kind of just let it go forward. So, yeah, I would say at the moment, I believe that they're locally, as much as you can pass out from a private company's IP, etc. But yeah, I don't think that, if I'm honest, that we're going to stay there. And that's, again, a concern of mine.
Yeah, there's some of these implants. They're starting to build wireless, sort of chips into these devices, and that presents further issues about hacking. I mentioned the pacemaker. I think Dick Cheney had a pacemaker where it did have that wireless function. They had to go disable it because he was scared that someone might just hack into it and disable it, right? And that's a real concern. And I think that once they become connected to the internet, they could give us certain benefits, but it also comes with a lot of other things that we get, the negative downside of being connected to the internet. So.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to know, we talked about what might happen if we cross a line by accident with good intentions. And we've talked about, what might happen once this technology is around. But what we haven't really talked about, and what I fear we're not talking about enough, is what happens on the way there. So for example, Adobe, we all think they're a trustworthy company despite Flash. But but they just released an AI feature into their Acrobat and just pushed it down people's throats with no ability to disable it, making people call their customer support to disable it. So companies have large costs of dealing with their users asking for questions. So that's a software company doing that and causing this. What about, with this kind of technology and the fear that these companies or companies are worried about being leapfrogged by other companies and throwing these established for decades-long safety guards out of the window, out of the fear of, getting bypassed by others?
Yeah.
Sure. It's also a shared fear of mine, if I'm honest. I think there's a lot of, with regards to one company in particular I kind of outlined, that there can be a bit of a cult of personality that can lead to potential decisions going the wrong way. I guess the example I would give is I don't know if you saw about X's feature recently, that now allows for video and audio calls. So anyone could directly dox or call someone, and everyone kind of went through a mad rush in the last week or so to disable it. That bothers me and doesn't bode well when that same person also owns one of the companies that I'm talking about. But it's not to make it a direct attack in that sense, but I just think that whenever we're putting profit over lives or profits over standards, morals, etc., that's when we have an issue and that's when we have a problem. So I think that's why more conversations like this are needed, but then also the regulation needs to be there from the beginning such that such a line can never be towed. So we kind of essentially get to the point where okay, we will do this, but we will never do that. And an example I would give for that, we'll see how it plays out, is I think it's the Boston robotic company. I've forgotten the exact name. But they came out with a pledge that they would not want any of their technology to be used for military purposes. And I think that was a pretty cool thing to do. Whether it happens in the long run, we'll see. But the idea that essentially a company can still have a moral standing even while it's innovating is something that I would like to see more of across the board.
Yeah, so in the old days, you have the pharmaceutical companies. They tend to be pretty conservative. They have a lot of regulations and also so on and so forth. Drug developments, people complain that it takes too long for a drug to kind of reach the market. But then you have the Silicon Valley, and their mantra is, move fast and break things. And so on that mentality, we have Tesla cars, we have these self-driving cars that get updates, and they're literally sort of stopping in the middle of the street or running over people. And there's not enough testing before new firmwares are rolled out. And that's I think that's a really serious problem. And I totally agree with Dr. Murray here that we need more regulations there. I chair the AI and digital governance group at NYU. And one of the things that we're trying to work on is to kind of regulate the AI space. And the regulation will have implications for healthcare, for a bunch of other things. So right now, there's really they're regulated by a different body. So the self-driving cars, they're regulated by the motor vehicle people, and they're not, they haven't been regulating software. And so it's just, that's more, try it. If it's broken, then we'll fix it in the next update, right? But you can't do that when the cars are actually on the road driving, with nobody, and sort of and then running over people. So, yeah.
We have one in the back here.
My concern is with the basic level of knowledge about the brain and what's being done in relation to it. It's not very long ago that we did not realize that the brain generates new neurons. That's a new discovery. At the same time, even more, a newer discovery is that half of what is inside our brain cases is something made up of glial matter, which is not neurons, but we don't know what it is, and we don't know what its function is at all. At the same time, we're talking about invading that brain space and actually wiping out parts of it, back to the lobotomy discussion. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned that we're racing ahead in exactly that lobotomy path without understanding at all what we're doing. We don't know how neurons decide which other neurons to connect with. However, in post-traumatic stress disorder research, we do know that we can train bundles of neurons not to connect with some other bundles of neurons which themselves create anxiety and bad traumatic responses. We can train those bundles to connect elsewhere, more into the rational frontal cortex parts of the brain, so that a person can think about the trauma without being re-traumatized by that. It seems to me that that's infinitely wiser from every perspective than talking about destroying some part of the amygdala, which is a central element in our whole human function. And I'd love to hear your comments.
Go ahead. He gets the more harder questions.
I guess. I guess I agree with you if I'm honest. I think that's the importance of, spheres of neuroscience, but different subfields also moving together. I think, I've come into, the neuroscience and space and this space with a background in chemistry, and that's essentially what can form a lot of my opinions on the subject, etc. And you see, now with this latest spate of BCI development, that you have a lot of engineers who essentially are coming across to this space and then using their engineering and essentially using those skills and adapting those directly to the brain. I think there need to be more of those interdisciplinary conversations from the beginning, where you're like, okay, we can do that, but there's a better way to do that. I think that's where the difficulty lies, because I don't know if you're within the academic space directly, but we don't talk well to each other, let alone to the general public. And I think that's, again, another concern of mine. We're at this point where a lot of the technology, which has been guided by Silicon Valley and guided by innovation within phones, etc., where that has moved on and come on leaps and bounds, and now we're trying to apply it with those same rules to the brain. And I think that's where the issue is coming in. So it's really about more guided conversations and having more neuroscientists directly with the engineers, such that essentially we ask different questions and we think about things differently, but we need to then be speaking the same language. So I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I agree with you, and just feel that those, well, we essentially get away from those issues when we're actually in the same room having those conversations and not existing within our silos and our little domains, and academia can be a problem when it regards to that.
Yeah, so I also want to agree with you that the brain, there are a lot of things we don't know about the brain. So Dr. Murray mentioned C. elegans. They are these sort of microscopic roundworms. They have 302 neurons. We basically have everything mapped out of the C. elegans. We have a computerized version of it even. Yet it's even though we know everything about the C. elegans, we know about the neurons. There's still so much we don't know about C. elegans. We don't know why it turns right, why it turns left, like why it decides to do this. And that's only 302 neurons. And so if you think about the human brain, I think the human brain is estimated to have, 86 billion? Correct me if I'm wrong. Around that figure. Just think of the scale. And the complexity of the interaction. So I think I just want to agree with you that you're absolutely right, that it's very complex. I do want to say there are a lot of, sometimes we kind of work backwards. Sometimes we, in a lot of these technologies, we sort of, there's a bit of trial and error. Someone decided to drink coffee and thought, hey, this is really great. And then, and they were able to stay away, and then now everybody's drinking coffee, right? There's a bit of, we're doing a bit of that too, with respect to some of these technologies. Hey, let's poke this area. Let's give it a little bit more electricity. See what happens. And then good, bad, and then that's how science is done, right? So there's a bit of mapping that out, but at the end of the day, you're completely right. There are a lot we still don't know, especially the interaction effects. So.
I know we have at least 3 more questions, and I'm just wondering how many more you two can handle.
We can do it. Let's
Okay.
do it.
Here's one.
We're here.
So you spoke a lot tonight about enhancements and problems with enhancements and problems that can happen with enhancing. We didn't speak that much about neuroplasticity, and there are a lot of programs that are out there right now that you could watch the program, improve cognitive function. There are programs that help you regain sight, regain hearing by increasing neuroplasticity. Do you see an ethical dilemma with working on increasing neuroplasticity and using that technology for neuroplasticity?
I do see an ethical dilemma. I think essentially, again, it would be the point I was bringing up about who stands to benefit or who gets these implants, because that would be one such example where, okay, you have this implant that could potentially improve your cognitive ability, but then there's also someone who can't have access to that. So I think it's more a question of access. I think that's where the ethical or the moral dilemma is for me, because you're essentially handing someone an advantage or putting someone in a position where they can improve things, but you're disenfranchising somebody else. So I feel that that's probably where the moral dilemma lies with regards to that.
Yeah, so I would try to think about what we can use that for, right? So people talk about cognitive enhancements, some people talk about mood enhancements, and there are even people who talk about moral enhancements, like can we get ourselves to be more moral, less selfish, maybe care more about the planet, and so on and so forth. And so if increasing some of the plasticity can help us do that, I say we should do it. So.
Thank you for asking these questions. I'm over here.
Oh.
So this question is for either of you. I'm very curious about the barriers to entry to these technologies. I mean, obviously you guys come from very capital-intensive intellectual centers, and so you have a lot of resources available to you and around you. But I'm curious about sort of like what the open source community could potentially do to contribute, or just like some of your thoughts around the open source community, what they might do, what they could do. From the outside, it seems very complicated and difficult and opaque what you do, but is it really? And could someone just sort of follow a tutorial online or a YouTube video to, create a brain-machine interface? I'm just curious to hear what you guys have to say about that.
I guess from a non-invasive standpoint, possibly. I would say one of the barriers, you're talking about barriers, is surgery, as we discussed. So a lot of, and I guess it is a good thing, a lot of these companies are also partnered with healthcare institutions, and usually they have co-founders who are also neurosurgeons or neurointensivists, etc. So there is that expertise, which is then kind of also innovating the engineering. So it's kind of like a meeting of minds. So I would say there's quite a lot of expertise with regards to that. But I think there's also a lot available that is open source for non-invasive implants with regards to the fact that you can get quite a few commercial EEG devices and potentially work on them and create something that essentially works on the signals that are read and then do something with that. And I think just generally, instead of just being open source, but the community is just the wider community also having an opinion and just being knowledgeable about the updates or the changes that are happening, which I guess why we're doing some of this, but also just kind of putting that in people's hands just generally, because I think there are a lot of claims going out, especially by some of these companies, and a lot of them are not referenced in science fact as well, and a lot of them are quite lofty goals, and a lot of them are just straight up lies as well. So it's really just a wider conversation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because of the invasiveness of some of these technologies, it's not something that I would generally recommend. So certainly with non-invasive stuff, there are a lot of startup companies. There's, where they're trying to use it for playing games, enhance your game playing abilities and stuff like that. I mean, in bioethics, they're these biohackers who they'll take cocktails that modify their genes and things like that. But I don't recommend them either. I think it's a bad idea. So yeah.
Thanks, guys. I'm to your left. If you want to look at me, you don't have to. Right here. Hey. Anyway, I was gonna say, okay, going back to the moral boundaries. I was wondering about the ethics of consent, and I guess the question or the scenario in my head is say there's a future where BCIs are so commonplace, it's like a tool, like intubation, for instance, or a scenario where it might actually affect the outcome of the life of a patient in a serious situation, where maybe a doctor can tell that the injuries are so severe, this person is not going to use their legs anymore. If we're going to do surgery, assuming that the surgery issue is always going to be a thing, should we just put in some implants and be proactive in the same way that maybe a comatose patient can't really give consent to all the procedures being done to keep them alive and keep them functioning, but maybe when they wake up, they're oh, well, thank God you didn't ask me because I couldn't say yes, but I'm still alive. And I'm wondering if there we'll ever be able to control the risks in that situation, and should a BCI always be the kind of thing where you kind of need to have consent, even in scenarios where maybe you can't give it?
Right. Good question. I would say this sort of thing already does happen with regards to neural implants, and with regards to certain research we do, where a patient may be comatose. I agree, they can't give consent, but usually through a loved one, next of kin, etc., we ask for what we call informed consent from them. So I could see a similar type of model. I guess the scenario where there's no family or friends to ask, then that may be a difficult thing. But we already do this with regards to neural implants, so that you could ask somebody who knows them, and then essentially you get the consent that way. I guess further to your question, just about BCIs in general, I don't think there will always be a situation where we're okay, we need to implant, we need to do this. But I guess definitely as a healthcare technology, I think that's a better space for them to be in. But consent for me in any case, in any scenario, is key, because we're potentially altering or aspects of the brain. So I think that that's where the regulation kind of should meet in the middle. But it's good to have those discussions from now and essentially get there.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. Sort of consent is really paramount, and so, but there are ways of thinking about substituted judgments or thinking about maybe the reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person do here, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, thank you both so much for this amazing talk. Regulation has come up a bunch of times, both in both of your talks and in the Q&A. But I guess the Boeing example is a good one of how regulation is only as good as the regulator. So in your view, are there any people with real power in the United States or elsewhere who sort of have their eye on the ball on these issues? And to the extent that they've designated an existing, for example, US regulator to deal with these issues, is it just FDA in the same way as they deal with new drugs? Or are there other bodies that are being talked about as meaningful regulators of this technology as it starts to be used in real people?
So there's you want me to answer this one? So there's the FDA, as you mentioned, and in aviation, there's the FAA, and motor vehicles, they have something else. I don't think they talk to each other that much, in part because, the space hasn't merged as much, but it's coming together, right? And so I think with AI being sort of pervasive, you can use it anywhere in any domain. I think some people are talking that maybe we need to have a separate thing just regulating AI in general. So take the European Union. So European Union has the AI Act. And so the AI Act regulates AI technologies irrespective of how they're deployed based on risk. And so that's like another different model. US tends to be more laissez-faire. They tend to their reasoning is that they don't want to stifle innovation, at least in the software space. In the AI space, so they have tended to say, let's see what what happens with it. But I think most people are recognizing that approach to now the current types of AI is untenable. It's going to cause so many more problems. So,
down in the front.
Hi, I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Hey.
These lights are so bright.
Yeah, sort of ventriloquist throws my voice over there. Yeah, I have a question. I have a sort of broader question about consent and proliferation of technology in general. Because as it stands right now, the degree to which I'm required to rely on cell phones and laptops just to make a living or exist feels non-consensual. And these are objects that are affecting my circadian rhythms, they're affecting my neurotransmitters, they're affecting my posture, they're already, we know more and more about the actual impact that they're having, and yet I feel ultimately powerless if I want to remain in society. It feels non-consensual already, just the way proliferation happens. So even assuming everything is ethical and scaling makes it accessible, ultimately proliferation feels non-consensual in the end. So I have a question about that.
Yeah. You want to say something or you want me to? Okay. So a lot of people feel that way, right? People feel I have a teenage daughter. She felt pressured to have a phone, at an early, age, and you just feel like you have to have it because everybody else has it, and if you don't have it, you're kind of excluded from a lot of different activities, and that's a real problem. And so that's already, I think you already pointed out, that's already problematic enough. The further problem is that AI companies recognize that and they're trying to make that even worse, right? By making it even more, say, addictive or more, they create a lot of different things such that you really need to use your phone for a lot of different things. So I think you're raising a really good question, and it comes down to, is this what we want as a society? Do we want to live like this? Where we're kind of beholden to these technologies and we don't really have a choice anymore, right? It's good, the phone's able, not in your case with the Uber, but I was able to call a car to bring me here, and that's really nice, But at some point, what happens when it overtakes our agency? So I think you're raising a really, really great problem, and one that it's actually hard to entangle, and it's something that we as a society need to kind of step back and sort of say, these technologies, have we gone too far, right? Do we need to make sure that at least don't make them so addictive so that you're doom scrolling all the time, right? And things like that, so.
All right, I think we have time for maybe just one more.
Thank you for the talk. This is kind of a science fiction question. One of your UK scientists called Roger Penrose, he came up with the idea that consciousness connects to the universe via quantum waves. So if that's the case, we can probably devise machinery or equipment that can manipulate consciousness and they can read our brain. So instead of BCI, you just use your consciousness. What do you guys take on this? I mean, what's gonna happen to humans when this happens?
You want me to answer that question, or you want to do it?
I'm not sure.
So right now I'm teaching a mind and language class, and we actually talked about Penrose's work, a couple of weeks ago. And we had Scott Aronson, who was talking about quantum, sort of computing and consciousness and free will. But I think that, as you know, there's the hard problem of consciousness, right? Which is that even if you if you can understand all the physical substrates of the brain, it's not clear that that's consciousness, right? And so that's like in philosophy of mind, that's like the $1 million question, like where is consciousness, right? So unless you're a physicalist and you think, okay, if you get all these substrates, all these neurons, you have conscious, and then maybe at the quantum level, then you have consciousness. But there are other people who are called dualists. They think there's something else besides that, like consciousness is somewhere else. But it's a big puzzle. That's how I would respond to that. So.
John? Dr. Murray, you're going to leave that one there.
Yeah,
I take it.
I think that question was above my pay grade.
All right. Well, thank you two so much for your wonderful talks. Let's hear it for Dr. De-Shaine Murray and Dr. Matthew Liao.